Hello and welcome to Inside Infrastructure, an inside look at the decisions and decision makers behind Australia's major infrastructure sectors. I'm Ilya Zak from series sponsor PwC Australia, and normally I'm joined for this intro by my co-host Adrian and Ilya, CEO of series publisher Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. Not to worry though, it's only the intro being recorded without him. He's still front and centre for our interview today for the first episode of the year with our special guest Amy Brown, Deputy Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet. Amy was actually a partner here at PwC and made the huge mistake of hiring me shortly before she began her current role, so I was pretty excited to speak to her for this episode. We recorded the episode last year, so you'll notice we didn't discuss things such as the bushfires that have been raging over the summer. What we did discuss quite a bit though was DPC's critical role as coordinator of service delivery, where multiple agencies are involved, and the reason I mention that now is because I think it's a very important perspective, especially given Amy was acting Secretary of DPC for much of the summer. So, without further ado, here's our chat with Amy Brown.
Amy Brown, welcome to Inside Infrastructure.
Thanks for having me.
Obviously, you're Deputy Secretary of Department of Premier and Cabinet in New South Wales today, but you've had quite a varied career leading up to this role. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your path to the job you're in now.
Sure. So going right back, when I was in high school, I wanted to be a professional actress.
And do you feel like you've fulfilled that destiny?
I feel like I fulfill it every single day. But my dad and my mum, I think, foreseeing a future of me being extra on Home and Away or working in Starbucks full time while I waited for the next job, said that they'd support me in my dream if I went to university first. So I think I fancied myself as Meghan Markle of Suits or the equivalent of that, and decided to do a law degree and studied law and social sciences at Macquarie University, fine establishment. Then I got a graduate position at Freehills and spent the next 12 years, funnily enough, in project finance, anything from the sale of Sydney Airport to financing power stations in the Middle East to the suite of PPPs that were going on across the country, particularly in schools, hospitals, prisons and social housing. I spent a bit of time in London and came back with a 112-kilo Irish souvenir called Rory and settled back in Australia where I focused on the PPP side of things. And once I had my kids, for some reason I wasn't quite satisfied to leave them at home to try and craft a watertight indemnity, and my indemnities were never going to be watertight anyway. So I decided to follow my passions and get a job with New South Wales Government. It was at the time when Mike Baird was the Treasurer and Peter Regan was setting up the Infrastructure Finance Unit, IFU. Seriously. And its twin unit, Strategic Liabilities and Asset Management Unit, SLAMU. So New South Wales Treasury was doing great things, and it was predominantly to try and get more private finance into the infrastructure sector and work out how we could work in partnership with the private sector to deliver good outcomes for all sorts of infrastructure across the state, being transport or the more what's known as social infrastructure sectors. So I focused on social infrastructure was my passion, but when you have a kind of $90 billion infrastructure pipeline, everyone has to muck in. So I did help out with things like North West Rail Link and the Light Rail, and Northern Beaches Hospital was one of mine, and restructuring Royal North Shore. So it was a really exciting time. And then went to PwC to help put some momentum behind their social infrastructure practice. But a couple of years later, decided it was time to come home. And with 9 months to go before the election, it was a really good time to join the troops back in New South Wales Government and get a whole bunch of projects delivered before the election. And started in Department of Premier and Cabinet as a Deputy Secretary.
So that is a pretty varied career, and it sounds like at the start you were it was a law degree mixed with social services. But was the intention always the infrastructure side, or were you interested in maybe something a little closer to the actual service delivery?
Yeah, good question. As an aside, when I was on maternity leave, I set up a fitness business called Fit Mamas, and the slogan was "From Baby to Babe." So I have tried my hand at many different
How did it go?
careers. It went okay. But no, it was good fun actually. We had nannies who minded the kids and trainers who.
Was it before Instagram?
It was. Oh yeah, it was.
I'm not
before
sure it's
Instagram.
possible to run a fitness business without
true.
Instagram.
Oh, that might have been my problem.
That was the whole.
But yes, no, I think like a lot of people, I kind of fell into the project finance space. It was basically chosen because when I did my graduate rotations at Free Hills, my favourite partner happened to be a project finance partner.
Who was that?
John Angus.
Okay.
Oh, he's project finance and structured finance, but close enough. So,
So did you see, when you embarked on law, you saw yourself maybe
I was
doing
going to be
an
Meghan
acting
Markle in
role and
Suits.
that kind of, in court prosecuting the case. So the acting theme is quite consistent.
Correct.
Then,
Yeah, correct. I actually really enjoyed that. So I did a lot of kind of mooting, which is like fake court case sort of stuff at uni. And even when we did our practicing certificate training, the one where you had to kind of get up and defend the little old lady who'd been, arrested for shoplifting, I actually really enjoyed that sort of side of it. But when you get offered a graduate position at, one of the most successful law firms in Australia, you're going to take it and see what happens, which I think is, don't say no to opportunities because you never know. And the worst thing that can go wrong is that you learnt something. So when Peter Regan was setting up the infrastructure finance unit, I clearly remember meeting up with him and he was talking about how it was going to be this unit in government with all these, ex-investment bankers, and they were going to have to sprint so fast because there was such a big infrastructure, so many projects in procurement, and we were going to have to just go at speed. And I said, you know what, Peter, I think you need a lawyer because lawyers look around corners. And you're also going to need someone who has advised the private sector as well as government, so that you can kind of, no one's going to check the documents to see if people are trying to game you in the kind of, technicalities of the wording. So I kind of started off in that I'm just a lawyer comfort space, even though actually he'd hired me as a director. I was there to be more than a lawyer, but I think when you change careers, sometimes you hang on to the thing you were doing before. So I really got into I did the template project deed for New South Wales and loved all of that, and, took the law firms to task on whether they drafted clause 42.1F correctly, and it was all, and that's great. But it's interesting that now that I'm more senior in government and I can see the whole picture, I kind of realise I was a little bit too, I couldn't see the wood for the trees sometimes because you just get so stuck in the detail.
So you started out with a whole bunch of project finance work. There must have been, and that's where your career has gone since then. Did you take was it purely on the job learning or have you, is that an area that you've studied formally at university after you started?
Oh, like in terms of doing project finance?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I don't know if this is too much of an aside, but I speak to my husband who went to university in the UK. He went to Oxford, and people at Oxford, they study languages, or he did chemistry or classics, or this, and then it teaches them how to think, and then they start the job and learn how to do the job.
Yeah.
Right? And so for me, I maybe used my law degree a bit, and it taught me how to, write a good essay or pass exams. But actually you learn so much more on the job because it's the stuff, it's the EQ, and it's how to work with people and how to use your strengths and how to plug your weaknesses and all of that stuff. And I think no matter what the subject matter, it's learning how to be good at your job. That's something that you can never study. When
you started at Free Hills, you got exposed to a whole bunch of major projects, particularly at the early stage of private financing infrastructure in New South Wales.
And transactions, not just projects.
That's right. Yeah. Are there any in particular that you worked on that were quite innovative and interesting for you in terms of the way those things were delivered here?
Or formative for you?
That's a good question. I think so. When I first came back to Australia in 2007, after my stint in London, I worked for Minters, and I used to advise consortium a lot bidding for PPPs. Interestingly, New South Wales was in a bit of a hiatus, so I had to spend a lot of time in Victoria and Queensland. And I advised the winning consortia on both the Victorian Schools PPP, Vic Schools 1, and South East Queensland Schools PPP. And I think for me, it's when I started to get that excitement of you're doing a piece of infrastructure, sure, it's all about, it was about it being built on time, under budget, and at quality. and what the private sector could bring in terms of a whole of life kind of view of that infrastructure, which is one of the, benefits of a PPP, and then the kind of the way that they do design, so that they can design and then roll it out across multiple schools. So there's some efficiencies in that and all of that good stuff. But it suddenly made me realise that government infrastructure was about people, and, I could point at those schools and say to my kids, I did that. And in fact, apparently my little boy walks around his school saying, my mummy's getting rid of these demountables. So, it's there's something so kind of purposeful in it. And that's when I started to really gravitate towards social infrastructure. And from then on, it was the projects I was fighting to be on was the schools, hospitals, prisons, social housing, and to start to kind of develop innovative models across those sectors. And it worked perfectly because there are a lot of smart people looking at transport, and there are a lot of smart people looking at social infrastructure, but at the same time, at that time when New South Wales was first getting its PPP, legs back, a lot of people were talking about transport, and it was good for me to really come in and test what we could be doing in the social infrastructure sense.
So you came back to government shortly after hiring Ilya here at PwC. Is he the reason that you left the private sector?
No, it was one. You need to hand me a tissue. One of the hardest things about leaving PwC when I just hired Ilya, and I just hired Boyd Russell, who is such a superstar.
Oh, sorry, Ilya is.
And Ilya is also such a superstar. And I felt like my team was finally complete.
Right.
And then Mama Bear left.
Had to go back.
And I left you with Big Brother Ben Rook. And for a while, and then he followed me as well. But
that's right.
I felt a bit like
I've
was
left places because of Ilya. You shouldn't.
It's true. Adrian and I have worked together in the past as well, and he was very encouraging when I discovered a new job opportunity.
I'll give you a reference.
So you're not the first.
Yeah.
But
when you say to people, I want to support you in your dream, all the way out this door.
So why did you decide that coming back to government? What was were there some particular things that you wanted to pursue coming back to government?
Yeah, I think part of the reason I struggled not being in government was because I've been in government before. So I was used to having front row tickets to the show, so to speak, where you can see that what you do every day, I really could see it having a direct impact, in some way, shape or form on the citizens of New South Wales and improving their quality of life. And the fact that I got to make decisions, or rather make recommendations to our good decision makers. And there was such a proximity to what was happening, particularly in infrastructure at the time. And so to then leave that kind of front row, seats of the show all the way to the nosebleed seats in the stadia, but it might be too early to make a joke about stadia. I found it really hard, and I'd see all these projects come down the pipeline, and I might have been involved in the scoping phase of them. And yet being a consultant, if I didn't win the mandate, I didn't even get to play. And when I did get to play, sometimes I knew that I was writing a report that was probably Appendix F of the, relevant submission. And I really struggled being that far away. And
you wanted to be more hands-on.
I wanted to be more hands-on, and not hear about being the last to hear that a project had been cancelled, or, being brought in at the 11th hour to write up a report about something. I wanted to be there the whole time.
So you've come to you went to DPC as I think you were Deputy Secretary for Economics and Policy?
Yeah, on day 3 I changed the name.
That's right. So can you tell us the title today?
No, it's changed again. So I first came in and I was Deputy Secretary. The group was called Economic Policy.
Okay.
I changed it to the Commercial and Economic Group, mainly because the acronym was KEG. So we had a lot of fun with that.
I think we're seeing a theme here with acronyms.
Yeah, I love my acronyms.
Yeah.
So that was predominantly, I inherited these amazing economists. A good chunk of them are based in Orange, and the other portion of the team are based in Sydney. And it's almost hard to know what to do with such a powerful machine. They are phenomenal. So they do some macroeconomic strategy for the state. Mm-hmm. So what should we be focusing on as a state? to improve productivity and therefore quality of life for all. So they have come up with some very clever strategies, including the economic development story for our regions, and right down to specifics as to functional regional areas and what the focus should be in terms of industries to generate the most economic benefit.
As a special activation precincts program?
Not quite, but special activation precincts have grown as a result of that analysis.
Right. So
correct.
Is there a danger of picking winners in that? You say this area does this thing and you end up with like picking a winner.
Well, it's less about picking winners. What they tend to do is say, well, for an area to be, prosperous, it needs an engine. And what is going to be that engine economy that results in the most kind of activity flowing from it? So if you think of the engine's the front of the train, and then the rest of the train is all the support services and jobs and benefit that's going to come as a result of having the relevant engine. So they're making sure that, depending on various endowments of different parts of New South Wales, what is the right engine to generate the most benefit. So
and then focusing government on
enabling that. Yeah,
anchor point, I guess, that won't move, that can enable all the other stuff.
Yeah, and even they're doing a piece for me at the moment, and it's what would greater connectivity mean for different parts of New South Wales. So that's not about a transport solution per se, or a certain number of minutes between a particular regional town and Sydney per se. It's about communities and how can being more connected, how can connecting people to jobs and education, but to essential services to each other, what can that do for communities and for the quality of life of individuals within those communities? Yes, we might eventually get to a transport solution around that, but that's not the question. The question is, what economic and quality of life benefit does connectivity bring?
So what's your title today?
I haven't even finished telling my...
what's
one of
the
my
title
branches.
What's the title today?
The title today is Strategy and Delivery.
We were discussing this earlier, and strategy is a catch-all term sometimes.
Yeah.
What does it entail in your particular branch or division?
Yeah, good question. So, we want, like I said, we want a better quality of life for all citizens, and I'm very deliberate when I say all, across New South Wales. And we can do that by supporting government to make good decisions and achieve its objectives. So we do that in a couple of ways. One is providing really good advice, and one is implementing projects, programs, policy initiatives, things like that. So for me, being at the centre of government comes with certain unique selling points, I suppose, where we have a bird's eye view and can see all of government. And so rather than standing behind a agency and looking over their shoulder while they do their BAU, I would much prefer that we take the issues, and this is in a strategic sense, that are really, really, really complex and involve lots and lots of different parts of government, and we bring the right people from around government together and we crash tackle that issue.
We actually spoke to Amy twice for this episode. The first was a while back, while a second session was recorded to include the most recent developments in the sector. Here's that second session now. So welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back. A lot's happened since we last caught up.
There has been a lot.
And, I was going to say it's nearly Christmas.
You can. Are we making these kind of monthly now? We'll just do a monthly chat and you can just update us on what's happened.
Chat in front of a microphone with a very good almond latte, thank you.
Fireside Chats with Amy Brown. That's the new name of the podcast.
Gosh, I could probably come up with enough material given my current role. But anyway.
Well, the first bit of material that we were hoping you'd discuss with us is in relation to an article you recently published on LinkedIn to do with some of your own experience with mental health. Can you talk us through that article for anyone, first of all, that might not have seen it?
Yeah, sure. So if anyone wants to read the full article, it's called Battling Giants and the Positive Side of Mental Illness, I think. And I wrote it during Mental Health Month, which was in October. And the purpose for me writing it, I think, was to do a bit of destigmatisation of mental health conditions. So I sort of started off by saying there are various mental health conditions, some of them more severe than others, but I have no doubt that someone will be affected by one of these conditions and still be a very productive member of society. I then went on to say that I personally have type 2 bipolar disorder, and that leads to periods of highs, sometimes extreme highs, and it can then be followed by periods of lows. And the best way to kind of tackle that, in my experience, is with a lot of kind of professional support. So to help manage the more extremes of those moods, but also with social capital and a really, really good network of people who kind of love and support you. So I wanted to put that out there, partly because I think I'm senior enough in my career now that people would, rightfully or otherwise, see that I've had some success. And so we're showing that successful people can have these things that affect our ability to be 100% of the time, because nobody is, and that's okay. And actually, sometimes in our weaknesses, there's actually great strength. So,
what's the response been to putting that out there in a very public setting?
I think the response has been really positive, particularly from people reaching out and saying, "Hi, I have something similar," or "I have something that affects me from time to time." But as I said to my boss, just think of it as if, I suffer from migraines and occasionally need a little bit of time and space to work through it. So it's been good. I think the flip side of it, though, is something that I'm starting to move people to, and that's what happens when people don't have the social and financial capital to be able to manage these things well, and they are entirely reliant not just on the public system, but on their own ability and agency to be able to use the public system well. And actually, when people aren't looked after, it can lead to quite difficult circumstances. So I gave the example that people who experience psychosis, which is a mental illness sort of related episode, are 5 times more likely to end up in prison. And that's particularly acute when it's women and where there's sort of drug use combined in with it. So we really need to make sure that our public system of mental health provision really looks after people, and particularly people at their most vulnerable. So people on exit from prison, or people who are at risk of homelessness, or people who are fleeing domestic violence situations. If they don't have their own social and financial capital to manage it, as I do, what are we doing for them?
I will come back to the sort of policy implications and the human implications of it. I just want to ask about your own mental illness and the impact on professionally on 2 fronts. One is, has it guided the professional direction you've taken, the choices you've taken to go into the field that you're in? And then once within that field, how does it frame the way you think about issues? And do you think that's different to how it would have been had you not suffered from mental illness?
I think on the side of personal characteristics, I think some of the symptoms that come with bipolar disorder have been a source of great strength for me. So it makes you very creative and relentless, and not being able to stop until a problem is solved. So that's actually a massive advantage career-wise, right? And also really high amount of natural energy, and you can, when you're starting to go for days without sleeping, you're actually in the danger zone. But it does come with that kind of level of relentlessness about things. But it also means that I see some of the vulnerabilities of society as a bit of a counterfactual. So I know that if not well managed, mental illness can lead you to all sorts of dark and scary places, and that's kind of not the people's fault who find themselves there. And then when they find themselves there, how are we helping them, particularly from an early intervention perspective, so that they're not kind of slipping off the ledge into a place that's really scary and absolutely suboptimal for themselves and their kids and their families and their employment status and all of that stuff. So I think it gives me a massive empathy for people who are vulnerable, and it also gives me a bit of a sense of responsibility to speak on behalf of people who don't get the opportunity to.
And so there's certainly that has probably already changed just in the last few years, because the stigma associated with revealing that you do suffer from some kind of mental illness seems to have changed just recently. I think I can remember that it would have been almost impossible for someone in your position just a few years ago to write the article that you did.
Yep.
Do you see that as one of your roles, making it easier for everyone else to come to terms with exactly what kind of mental health conditions they're experiencing?
Yep. So part of it is relaying that on behalf of people who can't. Part of it is saying it's okay, you can still be a great, productive, high talented employee. And part of it is actually the environment that I'm in. So if I look at the group of secretaries who, are leading the public service, they are all extremely authentic, compassionate, empathetic individuals. And I think part of that comes with the public service, the Q being in the second word of that it does attract people who, I think Simon Sinek said in relation to the military, but I would apply it to the public service. In the military, we give medals to people who sacrifice themselves for the sake of others. And in corporates, we give bonuses to people who sacrifice others for the sake of themselves. So I feel that in that environment where I have people like Jim Betts and Rod Staples and Mark Scott and Tim Reardon, and Em Hogan now has joined the crew, which is fantastic. So between them, I think I knew that they would get it and that they would support me. And
so that experience of yours, I guess you were saying it has coloured sort of your interest in social issues.
Yeah.
And I notice also that the Premier, whether it's a coincidence or not, since you've started, a lot of the Premier's priorities are associated with social issues, where she's previously been known, I guess, for a lot of more traditional heavy infrastructure like transport and the like.
I'd love to say that was down to me, but I don't think it was.
Well,
but I'm happy to support her in it.
Can you talk us through, first of all, what some of those priorities are that are a clear departure from what was there in the previous term? Yeah,
sure. I mean, for me, recidivism is one of the most acute priorities, and it is one that she talks about quite a lot. So there's a few elements to that for me. How do we try and, do that early intervention so that we're not locking people up in the first place? And then once they do find themselves in an unfortunate enough position to be incarcerated, how do we stop the revolving door that occurs where they're going in and out of the system?
Can you talk us through that in an infrastructure context? What do we think is because these days, I guess, to be honest, infrastructure has become a sort of catch-all for a whole lot of government. Just about anything the government invests in. What does it mean for that recidivism priority of the Premier's?
Yeah, and you make a good point, because infrastructure is nothing if it's not service enabling infrastructure. So I use the word infrastructure and flip flop between services that we're providing that need a piece of built form to do it well, and the actual built form and whether it's functioning correctly. So it's kind of good that you're mixing the two, because that's absolutely the right answer.
For what it's worth, I completely agree.
Yeah,
they're indivisible. There's no point in having a rail line if you don't have trains running on it. There's no point in having a hospital if it hasn't got medical staff.
Yeah.
Apart from the one in Westminster, which was the best run hospital in the UK. It didn't have any patients. But
which is ideal, right? If we have better community health facilities and enable people to manage their own health conditions and be healthier, then maybe one day we'll get to that point.
So I think answer really is question, but it would be good to actually talk about that. And I think the last couple of years there's been much more discussion about early intervention and keeping people out of infrastructure.
Yep.
From be a hospital or a prison or whatever it may be. So avoiding the use of the infrastructure as being an infrastructure question.
Yes, absolutely. And, if we think about a school where every kid is known, valued and cared for, they are less likely to end up on a trajectory of kind of self-loathing and isolation and, not feeling part of broader community that will then lead them to, making choices that end up in the worst place. And juvenile justice is something that particularly sends shivers up my spine. So, but in terms of in the role that infrastructure plays in, kind of avoiding these situations, even things as simple as specialised drug courts, or specialised Koori courts, which is for Aboriginal youths, where the incarceration rate for Aboriginal youths is 24 times what it is non-Aboriginal youths. So the whole point of those sort of settings is diversion from the prison system. So drug courts send people to treatment to rehab, to things that will engage them with the community instead of prison, because once people are in prison, it's very, particularly if they're there for short sentences, which people are these days, because a lot of the stuff is sort of on a more minor offences, personal sort of crime, like individualised drug use. So they're in there for so short, it's very hard to give them the services they need once they're in, if they're there for a short sentence. So avoiding getting there in the first place is first prize.
Do we do enough to support people when they graduate from prison? I don't know what the correct term is, but when people leave prison, are there enough services that
it's interesting.
People?
I think people are finally joining the dots, and the reason I say that is the Special Commissioner of Inquiry on ICE is going to be talking about this quite a bit, of it's not just about getting people healthier and getting them off drugs, it's actually joining up our whole service system. So when people exit prison, for me, starting point number one, housing. Because if you don't have safe and secure housing, what is the foundation that you have for any sort of a productive life? But there's housing, there's access to mental health services, because obviously there's the high incidence of mental illness and incarceration. There's reconnection with family and services that don't just, treat mum in a domestic violence crisis centre, dad in prison and a kid in out-of-home care, like wrap around the family and try and solve things so that they can stay together as a unit. That type of thing, I think we're starting to join that up more. Part of that is what we call the no wrong door approach, which is when someone with complex and vulnerable needs touches the system, so presents at emergency department with influenza, we treat their influenza, but we also look at them as a person. And if they don't have a safe place to sleep that night, or they're showing signs of post-traumatic stress, how do we make it that whatever door they come to government through is the right door?
So how do we, and again, in an infrastructure sense, so are you setting up your contracts being set up with certain outcomes that allow whoever the service provider is to innovate and maybe follow those cases all the way into their social housing location, or is it more does it stay in the public sector, that kind of whole of life cycle solution?
I think part of it is getting the public sector's house in order first. So I chair a lot of things because I'm DPC. It seems to be our role in life. But one of the things I chair is the Social Policy Senior Officers Group, which is deputy secretaries from around government, including Treasury, including Department of Communities and Justice and Education and Health and Liquor and Gaming and anyone else that we need around the table to have these conversations and say, right, when they're not Justice's customer or Education's customer or Service New South Wales's customer, they're New South Wales Government's customer. So how do we provide them with services that are as frictionless as possible? And how do we help people reach into government when they need us? Because the people who need us the most are the least likely to want to have an interaction with us, because every interaction in their life thus far has been negative. So it's having that, it's better use of data. So we've got our human services data set, which is 27 years worth of data of everyone and their families born after 1990. And I think it brings together over kind of 60 different service interactions. So it can show us the fact that vulnerable kids in Willoughby make up 16%, whereas vulnerable kids vulnerable kids in Walgett, which is near Lightning Ridge, make up 51% of that cohort of kids. So
can you use that sort of predictive analytics to work out where problems will occur rather than sort of retrospective?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. So there's one thing to look back on someone's life and say, oh, look, you first came into the system when your mum was pregnant with you, because we already knew, because she'd had a previous child enter into out of home care. But what's far more powerful is the predictive nature, because then we know who to wrap ourselves around. Obviously, there's some kind of sticky points about that. So if the algorithm or the actuary analysis itself comes up with a set of characteristics to identify on the day a child's born, the likelihood that it's going to end up needing specialised government services, or that it will be in a vulnerable situation. So things like mum smoked while pregnant. That's not causal, although it's not good to smoke while pregnant. It's actually associative. So if a mum smoked while pregnant, is in social housing, didn't have a medical appointment while she was pregnant until the baby was, after 16 weeks gestation, has been hospitalised for mental illness, those sorts of things, then we can say, actually, that's a bunch of kids who we want to look after in a very positive way in terms of empowering them to be at school and be given breakfast and be read to by the age of 3 and all of those sorts of things that if they miss out on, the trajectory is not looking very good for them.
So can we have, what are some targets? What are some numbers, some expenditure that the government's planning in this regard? These are absolutely very important perspectives, but how does this translate into I guess, not just the Premier's priorities, but sort of how are you going to measure success over this term or over the next 2 terms potentially? What does it look like for DPC?
Yeah, I mean, I think with data, yes, it's very measurable. So we can, we will be able to say in 10 years' time, there's, 5% less kids entering out of home care or 10% more kids finishing the HSC. Or something like that. And that's part of what the Premier's priorities are.
Have we got those kinds of very sort of objective goals, or is that something that still needs to be determined?
Yeah, on the Premier's priorities we do. Like there are specific goals around HSC attainment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander citizens.
Because something like recidivism, for example, is virtually impossible to measure. There is no single definition of recidivism. What if they commit a crime again after 50 years? Does that still count as recidivism, So what...
But you can measure it. I mean, you can say we know that from the data that the most likely reoffending time frame is X, and we therefore will target...
There's no single comparable measure across jurisdictions.
There's not the meaning of life from it, but you can presumably put in place measures that allow you to
and having the data is going to be better than not having the data.
Absolutely.
But part of it for me is how can we partner with the private and non-government sector? Because unless we all get stuck into these issues, they're not going to get solved.
So I was going to follow up on that, because across the value chain of services that are delivered to all people in New South Wales, there are parts that are delivered by the public sector, part that are delivered by the private sector on behalf of the public sector or on behalf of the taxpayer. There's some that are delivered by charities or sort of not-for-profit entities. What are the incentives for each of those to capture these people and wrap around them and do all the things that you've spoken about when they're driven by different
exactly
frameworks?
And there are different mechanisms in different contexts, right? So in the non-government, on the not-for-profit sector, sometimes it's funding, right? We're funding and we need to fund things that work, and we need outcomes are connected to the funding and the kind of incentive for that continuous improvement. But we were talking about social infrastructure before. We have PPP contracts with KPI regimes and outcomes that need to be met and availability payments that can be abated and all of those. I started in the kind of banking and finance sector, and it's amazing how powerful the kind of the finance element of it can actually be.
Can you give an example of how that's driving behaviour?
Yeah, lots. I think...
And specifically in contrast to what they maybe have done in a previous contract or what was happening in other settings?
I mean, everyone knows I'm a very big fan of PPPs and private finance. And
we will get to PPP discussion.
We will get... we're sort of straying into it though, aren't we?
Yeah.
Because
it was seamless until we just discussed how we're getting there. But
That's right. Surprise. No, but... Some of it is what happens when things go wrong, right? And it's quite amazing how much having private finance in the deal will drive people to the table to say, how can we fix this? We should want to fix it anyway, but it's amazing how that kind of sharpness and presence of mind...
I'm going to hold you to it, Amy. Give us an example. We want to know, because I think there are lots of really great examples. Like, we just need to be able to tell that story of what kind of, what a much more extended following a prisoner after they come out of prison to make sure that they have continued care with the social service system. Those are the kinds of things.
We don't do that.
We don't do that. Okay, so
we don't do that in PPPs.
What are the good
would you
examples
bank
then?
that? Would you bank an individual leaving prison, being drug-free, getting a job, and rekindling his vows with his wife? Like that's.
I'd certainly
it's
offer
too
it as
hard.
there could be an incentive, and if they can track it as a sort of bonus, then potentially it's something that you'd include. But
that's a tricky. I mean, I would prefer that, Service New South Wales evolved itself, which it is, and Em Hogan is a fantastic leader, and I'm excited to see where it's going, so that when that person presented to renew a driver's license or presented and didn't have a street address, we actually said, right, here's a package of services for you. Right. Instead of them having to try and seek out those services from 30 different providers by the time you throw all of government and not-for-profits in the mix. So I think a lot of those service things need to be driven by government, because they're, it is my job to care for the citizens of New South Wales. It could be Macquarie Bank's job if I make it, but I think there's something in almost, it sounds so PPP 101, but allocating the risk to the person best placed to manage it.
But that's the core of it. You say Macquarie Bank or someone else could do it.
I love Macquarie Bank.
The key is aligning a profit incentive with a public good outcome. If you can align those two things in a narrow or broad way, then private finance is a very, very powerful motivator to get an outcome. The question is our capacity to align those things. And
what outcomes can we realistically expect or not, right? So if it's designing a hospital that's also delivered on time and on budget, so that it works well over the course, the course of the contract or the course of its life, and the outcome sought is an appropriately treated patient, because we don't need to prescribe how often the windows are washed or the lawns are mowed, because guess what? You need patients to come to the hospital. So you can look after all those things, private operator. And that's the outcome we're seeking. Absolutely. And particularly where the private sector can offer A, more innovation, and B, more choice for patients, which just to stray into the Northern Beaches Hospital example, that's one thing I love about that hospital is my parents live on the Northern Beaches, and if they have, an emergency situation, they have to get an ambulance and go all the way up to Royal North Shore. And if they have elective surgery, they're driving straight through Frenchs Forest to get to the SAN in Wahroonga or again, North Shore Private. Now that there's a hospital on the beaches, a lot of people have choice in terms of public or private healthcare. And because it's co-funded by the private sector, it's a hospital that would not have happened without the private funding. And it's what the community had been asking for and waiting for 20 years, and we could finally make it happen. Were there issues in commissioning? Yes. I'm not an expert in hospital commissioning, but I know that there were some complications. But I think we shouldn't forget the fact that this thing wouldn't even be there to look after the customers on the Northern Beaches area if it wasn't for private and public coming together.
So do the public understand what a PPP is?
No. They're one extreme or the other. I think either they see it as it's only government and it's all, government's fault, which is why you can never fully transfer risk, because if it goes wrong, they're not Googling who is the private operator and writing a letter to them. They're angry at government, and that's probably fair.
It's a really interesting point, because the example that comes to mind where we did really successfully transfer all of the, effectively patronage risk, was something like the Cross City Tunnel.
Yeah, it's
where the government actually made money. I think there was $300 million paid up front for the privilege of taking on that risk.
I would characterise that as
is that where we sold it?
The taxpayer got a road for less than it cost to deliver.
Absolutely. But that is still viewed as a failure. And that was a successful transfer of risk, a failure on behalf of government. So
we got a tunnel.
We got a tunnel, and we
have a tunnel.
Absolutely.
I mean, the one thing about roads and stuff, that you build them and you use them. Like, they're kind of the asset is there and it's operational.
Yeah, it's relatively benign. Yeah.
It's relatively benign. So if there is a problem with, say, the solvency of the SPV or whatever, it doesn't impact service delivery.
Yeah.
Whereas I would be very concerned if the same would occur on Northern Beaches Hospital, where clinical services are provided by the private sector.
So is Northern Beaches then the last hospital PPP of that type?
I cannot speak on behalf of the government. But, what we do know is that Northern Beaches Hospital was procured and contracts were signed, and it was in construction on time, on budget. And
that's an important point, by the way. I don't know if there's any way to underline it in a podcast, but on time, on budget is a
Northwest Metro, $1 billion under.
Those are good outcomes. So how do we communicate that to the public? Because the stories for Northern Beaches have not been especially positive in most of the media coverage of it. Yeah. How do we communicate the positive outcomes to the public?
It's the public, they just want to show up to any government infrastructure asset and have a good service, right? And I think part of the issue is they see these things as the government. So, and they can have an amazing experience in a Service New South Wales centre, but if they have a bad experience in the local school or the local hospital or in a building certification or something like that, then it's a suboptimal experience overall. So, government has a tough gig. It's got very varied customer base. And people also, saying on time on budget and it was $1 billion under, people don't know what $1 billion, what is that relative to the state's budget? I don't know. I didn't know before I started working in government. So I
hope
think,
you know now.
Yeah, I'm pretty much there. But I think we kind of assume they all have jobs in our sector and know the nuances of contracting models. Really?
So I might have said this on this podcast before, but I had an experience of after a motorcycle accident of going to Royal North Shore Hospital, because that was where I happened to have the accident near there, which is a PPP hospital, everything up to but excluding clinical services.
Yeah.
And other than I had two broken arms, it was a good experience. There was. It's a clean new hospital. Yeah. Everything worked. I was given world-class medical attention. It was cleaned, and the right porters were in the right places, and everything was paperless and all of that. And yet everybody's got a Health New South Wales logo.
Yeah.
I knew it's a PPP because I work in the space. No other customer of that hospital knew that, and so my proposition from that would be, are we hiding the fact that this really good service I've received is actually being delivered mostly by private provision, and maybe we should be kind of crowing about that a bit more rather than kind of hiding it all under a Health New South Wales logo? Yeah,
possibly. And maybe citizens will be more on board with that if they were more involved in the first instance. So one of the phrases that irks me to no end is stakeholder management. Why are we managing our stakeholders? Why isn't stakeholders investment, where they're involved up front, they help co-design things, and then they see themselves in it and they'll defend it to the death? And you do see that with, say, I can think of an example of a school in New Zealand in a really disadvantaged area, and they got the Maori kids to help design the school. So there was a lot of Maori significance to the built form, and they haven't had a single piece of graffiti in the sort of 5 or 6 years since it's been open. So I think if you just sort of say, oh, there's a hospital, you're using that now instead, well, sure, but people don't see that themselves as a part of that, and they don't have that personal investment in it. But I don't know. The Waratah logo is pretty cool, though. I do like to see it on everything.
So what's going to happen with the PPP model over, whether it's over this term or the foreseeable future? Is it going to change? Are we going to see more of them, less of them?
I think now that Northwest Metro has been delivered, and it is fantastic, I would love to revisit the conversation of what other upcoming assets could be, could utilise the PPP model, and where is it the right size and shape that the market can digest it, and there's enough competition, because remember, we've got a heck of a lot of infrastructure on, and to do a PPP effectively, you do need, a healthy level of competition.
So one of the ways that, I don't know if we'd still call them PPPs, but they might be manifesting themselves, is through unsolicited proposals. It's one of the ways that they keep coming up in New South Wales.
Yeah.
We're receiving a whole bunch of them if we look at the DPC website that deals with USPs. What's going on? Why are we suddenly receiving so many?
I know. There's been a bit of a surge. I think part of it is a renewed approach to unsolicited proposals.
Maybe before you talk about the renewed approach, people might not really know what it is. Can you maybe just explain
yes, I'll do it in a nutshell. So when government wants to procure a piece of infrastructure or a service or what have you, it can do it one of two ways, either in a competitive setting where it puts the contract out and people bid in a competitive environment, or in what's actually called direct deals. So direct deals is broader than unsolicited proposals. That's where government deals exclusively with a particular private sector party to see if they can negotiate an outcome. Now, ICAC direct deal guidelines say that to justify doing that, you need to satisfy a number of criteria. And one of those is sort of something that resembles uniqueness, so that private sector counterparty is the only party who can do what they are proposing to do. Now, there is a avenue in New South Wales Government called unsolicited proposals. And that's where the private sector lob into us a proposal that says, hi, government, I have something really innovative and I think citizens would love it and I think they need it. And guess what? I'm the only one who can do it. And then we receive that and we make an assessment as to a number of factors. So it's not just uniqueness, but uniqueness does seem to be the number one hurdle because it's the hardest to cross. But it's also things like value for money to the taxpayer. If government does need to put in anything, be it any capital cost or land or, an opportunity cost type arrangement, return on investment to the proponent. So it needs to be appropriate, because if the private sector is making a profit off the thing, it can't be sort of unduly large, and things like alignment with government policy. So is it something that we have already decided that we want or need? So I think there's been a bit of a renewed approach to unsolicited proposals, and Sally Walkham, who heads the commercial branch in DPC, she's had fantastic leadership in terms of really ramping up the capability and capacity of DPC to handle these things and do it well. When we get a proposal, we don't sort of just do a yes or no. We actually stop and say, is this something that would be beneficial for taxpayers? Is this good innovation? And when we look at value for money, are we counting all the wider economic benefits and jobs and productivity and place? Because a lot of these have place outcomes, right? Or are we just looking at the valuation of a particular building? And when we look at uniqueness, that's kind of something that we really want to stop and question ourselves as well. So uniqueness is often because they own something. Either they have an underlying property right, and so entering into some sort of arrangement with government will have broader benefits in terms of, for example, catalysing a precinct, or being a missing link in terms of a place development that's kind of sitting there and hasn't quite been renewed because government doesn't own it, but somebody else owns it. So how do we do a project with them? Or sometimes they own a revenue stream, and that enables them to use that revenue stream to do a broader project or to do a monetisation or one of those more financial structures. So I think part of it is government's commitment to things like precincts. So it makes people who are landowners, for example, stop and go, actually, could I be part of this picture? And they're great proposals to receive, because precincts are something that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So we need good anchor tenants, and we need people who will renew their building to create more public open space and better built form and a better customer experience. So we're having a good time in terms of doing deals with the private sector for the benefit of taxpayers, and we always make sure that they are justifiable, auditable, they get audited, and that we have a proper evaluation process to make sure that everything is above board, the direct dealing is justified, and the value for money is achieved.
Can we talk about the innovation part of it? So if the principal hurdle to getting one of these up is owning something, revenue stream, piece of land, whatever it may be, how much of real innovation are you getting in these? Are people presenting stuff to you that's a genuinely new idea or a new way of doing something? Or is it just that they own a piece of land or a revenue stream and therefore they're the only people that can do this thing?
Often, yes, obviously they're the only people who can do it, but it does need to go further than that to be able to justify it. So if I use the example of they own a piece of land or a building, why are we getting involved? Where's the market failure there? They can just do whatever they have under their existing rights or planning consent or whatever to revitalise their own building.
And that is the majority of the kind of proposals that have come through, right? From people that happen to own some land, and it's usually properly related
of late,
at the
there's
moment.
A bit of that, yeah. But why would it be better for them to do it with us? Part of it is they use the land that they own for things like public realm, because they've seen government's commitment to public open space. So some of them will sacrifice, a part of their building to create a great pedestrian walkway, to go from a piece of transport through to, a park.
Just a final thing on unsolicited proposals. Is there, as we've been discussing, there's been a lot of property related deals. Do you see any room for something a little bit more out of left field, where I don't know, maybe there's a technology that's someone suddenly has access to, but then
Hyperloop. I'm joking.
yeah.
I'm not advocating for Hyperloop.
Maybe not advocating for it, but if some Elon Musk representative comes down here and says we want to build a Hyperloop from God knows where to somewhere else,
or a fast rail for $1 billion,
or a fast rail for $1 billion,
yeah.
Is there room for a policy change in the unsolicited proposal framework, or is it really just kind of you've got an idea that fits within existing policies and we'll consider it then?
I don't think we need a policy change. I think the private sector, though, has to think creatively in terms of what its uniqueness offering might be. So sometimes it's actually in a consortium because it's the combination of parties who maybe each of them by themselves could do,
That's a hard test.
It's a hard test. Right. And the other important thing about that is that the elements that can be competed are competed. So if you think about NorthConnex, for example, they had a unique right in the revenue stream of the two existing motorways, linking them, sure. But once we entered into an arrangement with the operator, the actual construction contract needed to be competed because that's how we could prove value for money. So, government's not going to be stupid about it. But I think sometimes if two parties come together and come to government with an offering that between them is unique, that's something that's interesting to us as well.
Sorry, but by policy change, I mean, if just as an example, let's say Waymo, Google's autonomous vehicle subsidiary, decides all of a sudden that Sydney's the city. They've looked all over the world. Sydney's the one they want. Would the unsolicited proposal framework be the model or the channel for them to, which would require a policy change from government to enable autonomous vehicles on Sydney's road? It's just an example. I'm pulling it out of thin air. But is that how the private sector would approach government with something, with an idea that they have, or is it through some other?
They probably would, because everyone seems to approach me via unsolicited proposals. But what I would tell them is, yes, we're very interested in Waymo and other innovative technologies, but some of it is actually the investment attraction piece, and that conversation is with Kim Curtin at Treasury, because she's the one who says, actually, to make sure that Sydney is on the global scale in XYZ sector, we need key industry players. And then she would have that conversation, because it's not an unsolicited proposal. It's just it's a great thing for New South Wales to have big companies bring their technology, resources, talent here.
Okay.
Call Kim.
We briefly mentioned faster rail services in the context of Elon Musk and Hyperloops, but we'll get back to more of the real world. Faster rail.
Faster rail.
Is something. So faster rail, not fast rail. I think it's an important distinction that people are focusing on. There's a current program of developing business cases alongside the Commonwealth Government for fast rail, sort of business case light. I don't know how one would describe them, but work with the Commonwealth Government on faster rail options, and then also some studies being done just by New South Wales. Maybe you could tell us about what's happening.
Very excited about this. So, yes, there are some kind of business cases done on a more granular level, but what I'm doing, what the Premier specifically asked me and my economists to do, is an overarching fast rail strategy.
Fast or faster?
Well, here we go. Everyone's so obsessed with speed. I'm obsessed with time, because time relates to humans and people and what they're going to do with their lives. So time is things like how long would a commute to work be? An hour? 2 hours? What about a interaction to go see a friend for a coffee? Your grandma, who you only see once every 6 months. That's how I'm thinking of it. If you look at the economic benefits, though, it does need to be pretty fast, because for people to change their patterns, change the options in terms of where they live, what sort of jobs they can have, for businesses to want to locate, say, regional, in one of our regional centres instead of Sydney, you actually do need quite high speeds, over 250 kilometres an hour or something. But I'm not thinking of it that way. And our strategy is much less focused on the technical, like the train bit. It is all about quality of life for people in our regions and connectivity in our regions that happens to involve a train. So for me, the strategy, it's about people, place, and economic benefit. So people. And when we went and did a lot of community engagement in the regions, we're like, what does your future look like? What do you want it to look like? What would it take for your kids to want to stay in the region, right? It's about people having greater choice in terms of where they work, partly because businesses would be locating in their region and partly because they could commute to other regions if they wanted to. And it's funny, when you talk to a lot of the regions, some of them don't care about getting to Sydney quickly. They just want to get to Mudgee. They just want better connectivity with their own region. So that was something. So therefore, it's not just about fast train to another destination. It's about place. So the renewal of the place where the rail goes, but also how is that place, say Newcastle, a gateway to the region, and how do we make sure that the train doesn't end there, but there's connectivity in terms of bus or local transport or point to point or Uber or whatever it's going to be, and then obviously having more jobs, both created but people better matched to their jobs because they have more choice, just leads to productivity uplift and general economic benefits. So it's a pretty good story, which you'll get to read about very soon because we're nearly done.
Where's the story up to?
We are doing the finishing touches on the strategy now, and it'll be released early next year.
Does the strategy involve more than just saying, here's a few potential candidates for faster rail? So you mentioned job matching. Ilya loves to talk about land tax reform.
Heavens.
One thing that could be done, and I'm sure your economists would support this, to help people match to jobs and things quicker, is actually to look at things like land tax where people can move more easily and there aren't barriers to moving to where work is. Is it without, I know you won't want to be too specific about it, but does this strategy have those other policy things around it rather than just here's 5 ideas for rail lines?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was so much broader than that, or else they wouldn't have given it to me. Because, I'm not particularly fluent in trains, but my big team of economists are the highest performing economists in the public service, if not the state. And so they are looking at things like quantification of wellbeing benefits or behavioural stuff. They have this fantastic tool which says why people make the decisions they do. So why do people live where they live? A lot of it is social connectivity, sentimentality as to place, access to jobs, access to where they like to have fun. Do they like to be near the beach? Do they like to be near a national park? And what role and people are willing to sacrifice commute to work times as a trade-off for some of those things, right? So, I grew up on the North Shore, and some of my friends who then said, well, we could live on the North Shore or we could have a bigger house if we moved to the Northern Beaches, have made that choice. It takes them 20 minutes longer to get to work, but that's a trade-off that they've made. So if you then scale that up in terms of a regional network of rail and other supporting transport infrastructure, the conversation gets a whole lot more interesting. So I love the tools my economists have built. There's nothing like it, in the world. And being able to play around with these things both on an urban and a regional scale and a statewide scale has been absolutely fascinating. So I hope that translates into the report and that you get a really rich read, not just 250 kilometres an hour versus 285.
That's a really good point that you've just made. It's not just faster rail over and over again has been faster or very fast, whatever
moderately
it is.
Quick trains.
Moderately quick trains.
Straightening one curve.
Have always been the travel time saving has never been enough to justify it in Australia. It is almost completely reliant on substantial land use changes. And I think maybe that's a slightly different version of Adrian's question. Is there so whether it's something like a land tax or whether it's significant changes to planning controls, is that at what stage does that need to be considered to justify these current faster rail proposals? And I think you've already identified some of the routes, so maybe you can talk about specific locations. I don't know, but how do we consider the whole all of the benefits of the project, capture them in such a way that the government can actually afford to do it, and then deliver it? What's the secret there?
Yeah, and we do need some optionality even in the strategy, or else, if we just present one option to government that is blocks out the sun in terms of the capital cost, and has some benefit, it just get tossed aside.
Absolutely.
So
and rightly so.
Yeah, and rightly so. So there is some stuff in there in terms of fast rail ready, and, how are regional centres, even if there's not going to be fast rail in the next short while, how do we actually fix the regional connections? What are the quick wins in terms of actual, rail infrastructure? Is it straightening tracks? Is it tunnelling things? So there are options there. And then what would 20 years look like? And what would we recommend?
So does that extend to planning controls? Does that extend to a consideration of how much development there would need to be in order to justify it?
It definitely shows the population uplift in different areas, and it is actually quite interesting which areas grow. You'd almost be surprised. Some of them grow because, how do I put this? People don't necessarily want to live in the destination, but they want to live in a small town near the destination, and suddenly they could work in the destination, that sort of thing. So close proximity to big centres. That's definitely something for a second stage. These aren't final business cases or implementation plans. This is it a good idea?
I guess what Leah's talking about, though, is the evolution of the idea of a business case from being about this piece of infrastructure to about a place, but then including the policy or planning overlays that enable a place. I think we see it a bit in Western Sydney.
Yep, and a bit in GPOT.
But there's I think the New South Wales government did some really good stuff around the digital driver's licence and having trial areas. So a sort of sandbox, a regulatory sandbox outside the main centre, test something. I think, not to verbal Ilya, but is this an area where you could try those other things out and talk about a different set of planning controls or a different set of taxation regimes in order to maximise the benefit of a very substantial potential investment?
And sort of spell them out at this early stage, so that, because if we get to another, I can't remember what was that, the East Coast high speed rail study, if we spend tens of millions of dollars and then only at the last second discover that we'll need to sell X amount of land or whatever the complicated things are, then people get very excited, and then they discover that all these massive changes are needed that they're not willing to do. Whereas if that really has to be part of the package up front, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. And I think it's exactly as you said. We need to be having the conversation now, because we don't want to all buy into an idea then realise we can't fund it, or the land use doesn't permit it. But I think we're getting a lot more, part of it's joined up government, right? We're getting a lot more sophisticated at having these conversations. We now have the tools to quantify economic benefits. We can quantify the economic benefit of a park. Like, that's where we're getting to in terms of this. So we've come a long way even in the last 5 years. And I think we've been bitten in the bum enough times where we've got the community all bought into something and then realised it's a bit more complicated than we thought in terms of the funding mechanism, that we're having the conversations now, and not misquoting projects from overseas like Crossrail or something that are very specific to those circumstances, and making presumptions as to what we can or can't do in the Australian context. So
that's another neat segue into another question that we wanted to ask you about. How there's a lot of discussion, especially usually around election time, but still going at the moment, of seeking funding for these projects from the federal government.
Oh yeah.
Faster rail, I'd imagine, is a candidate for that.
Yeah.
But so are lots of other projects, or sometimes they're not. And is there how do you go about deciding what qualifies for some federal funding or a request for federal funding? How do you decide?
I wish I decided. I'm really excited about the conversation with the federal government around funding infrastructure. I like it that the conversation is, what's the greatest bang for your buck? What will benefit people the most in terms of, and what will benefit the nation the most? So, transport connectivity to the second airport, that is very obviously a good idea for New South Wales. It's a good idea for the nation. It's obviously a good idea for the federal government who own the airport. So it's very cool to be having those level of conversations with the feds, instead of either just us coming cap in hand and saying we want some money please, without actually having what will the results be? What will the outcomes be? How can we convince you that funding it now, putting the funding in, or Adrian's favourite thing, funding it quicker, is a good idea.
Is there
So
a
I'm
formal
enjoying that conversation.
Is there a formal channel here, or is it kind of sometimes
there are
you'll be at a lunch
counterparts
with a minister?
of me. No, I have, public service counterparts in the federal government, Department of Infrastructure, who I know well, and who, yes, the politicians, political class can promise things and discuss things, but at the end of the day, it has to be implementable, and so that's when I get to be part of the conversation.
Because it's not. They don't automatically just pick things that are the top of the infrastructure priority list, Infrastructure Australia's infrastructure priority list, do they? It's kind of sometimes a project just ticks the right boxes. Yep. Sometimes it doesn't.
Yep.
I guess. Do we know what those boxes are?
I think when the federal government makes commitments around congestion busting or the second airport, or it starts to become
just
obvious.
To clarify, Sam Sangster made very clear that it's not Sydney's second airport, it's Western Sydney's first. He was quite
important distinction.
Oh my gosh, can you erase all that? You're right.
I'm going to play it back.
I've been picked up on that before.
Yeah.
What do we call it? Western
Sydney's first airport.
Yeah, you're right. I remember when I was here, someone said second airport and they got in a lot of trouble and they said it on the internet.
Oh, I was making it funny.
Still keeping it in. Yeah.
Oh, well. Sorry, Sam. Anyway, yes. So it's got a lot more nuance than ticking boxes.
So I'm going to be a bit more pointed about it. One of the things I've been quite vocal on publicly is that there's not really a unifying vision from the Commonwealth Government on what it wants from the infrastructure dollars it spends, what the objectives are. And I think that it would be easier for the states, for industry, for the community to understand what it's bidding into the Commonwealth for, and what the objectives are. Is it urban congestion? Is it road safety? Is it some other thing? It feels like there's lots and lots of objectives of the state of the Commonwealth Government at the moment. Is there a challenge from a state perspective about knowing what you're aiming for when you ask the Commonwealth Government for money, and how much you can ask for as a result? And is that just a kind of black box that spits out an answer, or is there a...
One good thing to do, though, is what I would always do, is brief my ministers, including my Premier, who I have the privilege of serving, so that those conversations can be had at political level and we can get some clarity.
Is that, and sorry, this is a kind of another version of the question I asked earlier, is that where the conversation happens from minister to minister, or is it at a public sector level? What unlocks the path towards funding? The politics or the bureaucrats?
I think senior public officials briefing consistently each of our counterparts is very helpful, because then when they come together to discuss, they're both, singing from the same song sheet, so to speak. So that's why I see the conversation with my counterpart in the federal government as so crucial in that relationship, because I can check in what he's feeding up the line, and therefore what I should be feeding up the line. And we're pretty good at being consistent about it, because we both want good infrastructure for the state. What
can they do to... keeping in mind that Infrastructure Australia is there and potentially, some kind of filter for these kinds of proposals, or, in theory it should be the main filter. What can the federal government do to kind of make that clearer for the states? Here's a pot of money that is it establishing a pot of money kind of like the Restart Fund and saying, go figure it out, make applications? What do they need to do? With
certain parameters.
Yeah.
Yes, potentially.
So, Amy, we ask everybody at the end of this podcast one question that defines them. What's your favourite sort of infrastructure and why?
My favourite sort of infrastructure, I think it's schools, for two reasons. Firstly, they're the beating heart of a community. And secondly, they're the way that every individual child can feel known, valued and cared for. And that's the best way to set them on the course of a productive and fruitful life.
Well, that's...
You've got a tear in your eyes. You've got a tear in your eyes.
I didn't know what to do.
I was just on a panel with Mark Scott, so it's all like right here for me.
That's the most articulate response we've ever had. Someone's bridges.
Yeah, whatever. Something that I can travel on.
Yeah, see? Goes to show your other people that you interview.
Yeah. Alrighty, well, thank you very much, Amy, for being so generous with your time. You've been very generous of you. We really appreciate your insight on the New South Wales government. And we'll hope to have you back again soon.
Thanks for
First
having
recurring
me.
guest.
Yeah, and thanks for the almond latte. I'll come back.
So that was Amy Brown from DPC in New South Wales. I think it was a good discussion, and clearly she's passionate about the ability of government to improve the lives of its citizens. Tim Reardon, the Secretary of DPC, was clearly on the money bringing Amy back to government, and hopefully we'll see continued success in managing the state's enormous infrastructure pipeline. That's it for today. Thanks as always to PwC Australia for their continued sponsorship and hosting of the series. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast platform to Inside Infrastructure and leave us a rating or a comment on LinkedIn. If you have any guest suggestions, then please feel free to send us those either to Ilya or myself. We've certainly appreciated the messages we've been receiving so far. This episode was recorded and edited by Adam Stevens from TAG, PwC Australia's internal media agency. Research was conducted by Linda Bergerson, Michael Player and Brendan Pearce.